Before we drift into the shadows of history, don't forget to whisper your loyalty to Nightfall Notions, where the past isn't just remembered, but relived in all its tedious terror. A simple click on that subscribe button ensures you won't miss the next chapter of your existential insomnia. Now, let us descend into the first uneasy dream. Chapter 1. The Dream as a Gateway to Sin. In the flickering candlelight of a monk's cell, Brother Aldrich clenched his fists against the straw mattress, his brow slick with sweat. The nightmare had come again. Not the usual phantoms, no dragons, no devils with pitchforks, but something far worse. His own thoughts twisted into visions so sweet, they curdled his soul. He had dreamed of honey cakes. Not just any honey cakes, but the ones baked by Widow Marta, whose hips swayed like a bell tolling for vespers when she walked to market. In the dream he'd eaten them greedily, licking the sticky gold from his fingers while she laughed, her kirtle slipping off one shoulder. Then the horror. He'd reached for her, not for the cakes. Brother Aldrich groaned into his palms. This was the third time this week. By dawn, he'd have to confess to Father Clement, who would doubtless assign him another week of bread and water, plus 50 lashes for good measure. The worst part, the dreams didn't even feel like temptations. They felt like memories, as if his sleeping mind had peeled back a layer of piety to reveal the truth. He was, at his core, a man who would trade every psalm he'd ever copied for a single touch of warm skin. This was the medieval understanding of dreams. Not random misfirings of the brain, but battlegrounds. Theologians like St. Augustine had warned that sleep was when the soul, unmoored from reason, floated perilously close to the abyss. Demons didn't need to drag you to hell. They could simply wait for you to dream yourself there. A peasant might dream of stealing his lord's sheep and wake with the guilt of a thief. A nun might dream of dancing barefoot in the tavern and rise with the shame of a harlot. The church stance was clear. Dreams were not yours, but they were your fault. Take young Eleanor, the blacksmith's daughter. She'd confessed to the parish priest that she dreamed of flying, not on wings, but on the back of a giant black cat that spoke to her in rhymes. The priest had crossed himself so violently he bruised his chest. Flying dreams were notorious. St. Thomas Aquinas had written that levitation in sleep was a favorite trick of demons, who used it to convince simple folk they'd been gifted with magic. Eleanor was given a penance of crawling on her knees to the shrine of St. Michael, but the damage was done. The village now eyed her as if she might float away at any moment. Then there was Sir Guy de Montfort, who'd returned from the Crusades with a peculiar affliction. Every night he dreamed he was back in Jerusalem, not as a conqueror, but as a baker. He'd knead dough in the dream, humming Saracen love songs, only to wake with flour under his fingernails and a haunting melody on his lips. His confessor declared it a crisis of faith. Why would God torment a knight with visions of peace? Guy took to sleeping in his armor, hoping the weight of chainmail would pin his soul to righteousness. But the most sinister dreams were the ones that carried the whiff of heresy. Brother Aldrich had once copied a banned text that claimed dreams were messages from a parallel world where God had made different choices. In that world, Eve had never bitten the apple, and the serpent preached sermons in cathedrals. The author had been burned, of course, but the idea lingered like smoke in Aldrich's mind. What if his dreams of Widow Marta weren't temptations, but glimpses of a life where he'd never taken vows? A life where he was just a man, weak and happy. That was the true danger. Medieval reality was harsh, but predictable. Pray, work, suffer, die. Dreams offered a blasphemous alternative. A world where desire didn't damn you, where joy wasn't a sin. No wonder the church policed them so fiercely. To control the night was to control the soul. As dawn bled through the monastery windows, Brother Aldrich rose, his back aching from tension. He'd recite the penitential psalms before confession, scrubbing his mind clean. But even as he knelt, he knew the truth. Dreams were like rats in the cellar. You could flood them with holy water, but they'd always return, gnawing at the foundations. Chapter 2. Nightmares as demonic visitations. The villagers called it the Hag's Ride, not because an old woman was involved, though some swore they'd seen her, a withered crone with breath like rotting meat, but because the sensation was always the same, a weight, impossibly heavy, pressing down on the chest, as if a horse had settled there in the night. Then came the whispers, not in the ear, but inside the skull, as though something had slithered into the mind and unspooled its thoughts like a ribbon of smoke. Young Edric had suffered his first visitation at the age of 12. He'd woken paralyzed, his throat clenched tight as a fist, while something crouched on his ribs and laughed in a voice like grinding bones. It spoke of his father's death, not the peaceful passing the priest had described, but the truth. The old man choking on his own blood in a ditch, forgotten by God and man. When dawn finally broke, Edric's mother found him curled on the floor, his nightshirt drenched in sweat. The village cunning woman nodded sagely and hung a pouch of dried mugwort around his neck. It didn't help. The church had a different explanation. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams. They were literal demons, small and spiteful, dispatched to test the faithful. Theologians debated their taxonomy. Were they fallen angels or lesser spirits spawned from the corruption of the world? The most popular theory came from the Ye Maleus Maleficarum, which claimed they were incubi and succubi in their most rudimentary form, too weak to assume full human shape, but still hungry for human weakness. Their method was simple: press down on the sleeper's chest to steal their breath, then pour poison into their ears. A nightmare was just the first symptom. The real damage came later, when the whispers took root. Sister Juliana, the convent's most austere nun, kept a diary of her visitations. In neat, trembling script, she recorded how the demon came every new moon, perching on her like a toad. It never spoke of carnal sins. She was, after all, 63, and had long since forgotten what desire felt like. Instead, it whispered heresies in the voice of her long-dead mother. Why kneel to a God who lets children starve? What if the Bible is just a story, and heaven a lie to keep the poor from rioting? She'd confessed these thoughts to the abbess, who prescribed nightly flagellation. But the demon seemed to enjoy the spectacle. Last time, it had chuckled as the whip bit into her back, murmuring, "See how eager you are to suffer for nothing." And see, listen again. Then there was the case of Bertrand the Miller, a man so notoriously stubborn he'd once argued with a bishop over the price of sacramental bread. His nightmare didn't bother with whispers. It simply sat on him, night after night, until he developed a perpetual wheeze. The local priest sprinkled holy water around Bertrand's bed and advised him to sleep with a crucifix on his chest. The next morning, Bertrand woke to find the crucifix flung across the room, the Christ figure's arms twisted backward. He took to drinking himself into a stupor just to avoid sleep. It worked, in a way. The demon stopped visiting. Instead, Bertrand began seeing it in broad daylight, a shadow with too many teeth, grinning at him from the corner of the mill. But the most unsettling account came from a traveling scribe named Peter of Linz. He claimed that his nightmares had begun after copying an illuminated manuscript for a nobleman's library. The book was old, its pages edged in gold that flaked off like dried skin. On the third night, the demon came, not as a weight, but as a presence beside the bed, cold fingers trailing up his arm. It spoke in perfect Latin, quoting scripture backward. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was hungry. Peter fled the nobleman's employ, but the demon followed. Now it dictated its own text to him in his sleep, a blasphemous gospel written in a language he didn't know but somehow understood. He'd wake with ink-stained fingers and paragraphs of cramped, alien script littering his floor. The last time anyone saw Peter, He was burning his own manuscripts in a ditch, laughing as the flames turned the words to ash. The church's solution was a mixture of prayer and pragmatism. Holy water under the bed. Psalms recited before sleep. Some particularly devout souls slept with their hands folded over their chests in the sign of the cross, as if to armor themselves against the dark. But everyone knew the truth. No one was safe. Sleep was the crack in the door, and the nightmares were always ready to slip through. Brother Aldrich, still reeling from his honeycake visions, now faced a new horror. Last night he hadn't dreamed of Widow Marta. Instead, something had pressed down on him so hard he'd felt his ribs bend. No whispers came, just a slow, deliberate wait, as if the demon were savoring his fear. When he'd gasped awake, his candle had flared green for an instant before guttering out. That morning, he'd found a single black feather on his pillow. He knew what it meant. The demon wasn't just visiting anymore. It was moving in. Chapter 3. Dream Prophecy, a Dangerous Gift. The first time Agnes of Metz dreamed of the plague, she thought it was just another nightmare. The streets slick with something darker than rain. The silence where there should have been bird song, the way the church bell tolled without a rope being pulled. These were the kinds of details any anxious mind might conjure. But then the baker's son coughed blood onto his mother's apron, in precisely the way Agnes had seen 3 nights prior, and suddenly her dream was no longer just a dream. It was a prophecy. This was the razor's edge upon which dreamers balanced. A peasant woman who foresaw a harvest's failure might be called a seer, provided the local priest approved of her piety. A monk who dreamed of his abbot's death could be labeled a vessel of divine wisdom, assuming the abbot didn't recover. But let that same peasant claim she'd spoken to the Virgin in her sleep, or let the monk describe visions that contradicted church doctrine, and the tone shifted dramatically. Prophecy was only holy when it was convenient. Agnes knew this better than most. After her plague dream proved accurate, the villagers began leaving offerings at her door. A loaf of bread, a handful of beans, once even a scrawny chicken, in exchange for glimpses of their futures. She tried to refuse, but hunger wore down her principles. Soon she was interpreting dreams for half the town, always careful to frame her visions in ways that wouldn't alarm the priest. When the blacksmith dreamed of a river swallowing his forge, Agnes declared it a sign he should reinforce his foundation. She didn't mention the part where she'd seen his corpse floating in that same river. The trouble started when Lord Reynard's steward came knocking. The nobleman had dreamed of a white stag with blood-red antlers, and he wanted Agnes to explain it. She took one look at the steward's pinched face, and knew this was a trap. Nobles didn't consult peasant women unless they were desperate or setting a snare. Still, she went. Lord Reynard's castle smelled of dampstone and boiled cabbage. He received her in a hall hung with moth-eaten tapestries, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair like a spider testing its web. "Well," he said, "what does it mean?" Agnes closed her eyes, letting the image of the stag rise in her mind. Its antlers weren't just red. They were dripping, each drop hitting the ground with a sound like a hammer on anvil. Behind it, the trees bent as if in a gale, though the air was still. A warning. A death. But whose? She opened her eyes. "A great hunt approaches, my lord. The stag is your house. Noble, but marked for treason." Lord Reynard finished, his smile sharp as a blade. "That's what Brother Arnulf said, that the dream foretells rebellion." He leaned forward. "No, here's the interesting part. Yesterday my huntsman found a white stag's tracks near the eastern border, where your brother and his friends like to poach. Strange coincidence, isn't it?" Agnes' mouth went dry. Her brother hadn't set foot in the woods in months. But Lord Reynard had been looking for an excuse to clear the eastern villages for years, their lands too rich for his liking. A prophetic dream was just the justification he needed. She was still trying to form a reply when the steward grabbed her arm. "Well, start with her," he said. "See what else she's foreseen." The dungeon was colder than Agnes expected. Darker, too. As the steward lit the brazier, she wondered if this was how all prophets ended. Not in glory, but in a cellar, their visions twisted to serve someone else's greed. Meanwhile, in a monastery 50 miles away, Brother Aldrich was having his own prophetic dream. A flock of ravens circling a burning tree. A voice, his own but deeper, frayed at the edges, whispering a verse from Job, uncovers the deeps out of darkness and brings deep darkness to light. When he woke, his palms were scored with half-moon cuts from his nails. He told no one. Prophecy was a gift, but only if you survived it. Chapter 4. The Church's War on Dream Divination. When Bishop Guillaume's edict went out, nailed to church doors across the diocese, it wasn't the usual fire and brimstone rhetoric. The parchment smelled faintly of lavender, as if the scribe had tried to soften its message. The words, however, left no room for gentleness. Any person found practicing oniromancy, whether by interpretation, invocation, or the keeping of dream journals, shall be subject to examination for heresy. The villagers called it the Dream Decree. On the surface, the Church's position was straightforward. Only God could send true visions, and only his ordained servants could interpret them. But, as with most things involving power, the reality was more complicated. The bishop's own library contained a well-thumbed copy of Somniale Danielis, a dream interpretation guide, so popular even kings consulted it. The difference, of course, was that when a bishop dreamed of a falcon tearing out a dove's throat, it was divine allegory. When a midwife dreamed the same thing and warned her neighbor about an impending miscarriage, it was witchcraft. Brother Aldrich discovered this hypocrisy firsthand when he was assigned to investigate a case in the village of Saint-Étienne. A young shepherd named Colin claimed to have dreamed of an angel who showed him a hidden spring that could cure the wasting sickness. The next day, he'd led his flock straight to it, a trickle of water seeping from a mossy rock, sweet as honey on the tongue. 3 people drank from it and recovered by sundown. By the time Aldrich arrived, the rock had been chipped away by desperate pilgrims, and Colin was sitting in the mayor's cellar, with his hands bound, awaiting judgment. The bishop's instructions had been clear: determine whether the dream was divine or diabolical. Aldrich knelt beside the shepherd, noting the boy's chapped lips and the way his knees knocked together. "Describe the angel," he said. Colin's voice was hoarse from repeating his story. "It had 6 wings, like in Isaiah. And its face, it kept changing. One moment it was my mother. The next it was the old priest who died last winter. It spoke in rhymes. Where the earth weeps silver, the sick shall rise whole." Aldrich frowned. Angels didn't usually rhyme. Neither did demons, for that matter. Did it ask for anything in return? "Only that I tell no one, but the pure of heart." Colin swallowed. But the mayor's wife was coughing blood, and I told everyone, Aldrich finished. That was the first mistake. The second was the wings. According to Augustine, true angels only appeared with 2 wings. Extra pairs were a hallmark of deceptive spirits. Aldrich should have condemned the boy on the spot. Instead, he found himself asking, "What did the water taste like to you?" Colin blinked. "Like nothing. Just cold." "Interesting." The pilgrims had sworn it was sweet. Aldrich had dipped his own finger in it and tasted only iron. He was still pondering this when the mayor's daughter burst in, her cap askew. "Another one," she panted. Old man Leon woke up screaming about a bull with a man's face. Now his cow's giving blood instead of milk. Aldrich pinched the bridge of his nose. This was why the church hated unauthorized dreamers. It wasn't the prophecies themselves, it was the chaos they unleashed. One person's vision could unravel an entire village's peace. Meanwhile, in a cell 3 days' ride away, Agnes of Metz was learning the real cost of dream interpretation. Lord Reynard's torturer was a meticulous man who favored a hooked knife for removing fingernails. "Let's see how well you read omens without these," he murmured as Agnes bit down on the leather strap between her teeth. She'd tried to explain that she didn't choose her visions, that they came unbidden like crows to a field. But the torturer wasn't interested in metaphysics. "The bishop says dreams are like letters," he said, wiping his blade on his apron. "If you can't help but read them, that makes you the devil's postman." Agnes spat out the strap. "Then why does your bishop keep a dream book under his bed?" The torturer paused. That was Agnes's second mistake. By the time Aldrich returned to the monastery, rumors were spreading like rot through wheat. A nun in Provence had dreamed of the Virgin, wearing a jester's cap. A butcher in Lyon swore his dreams were being stolen by a shadow that left copper coins under his pillow. And in the bishop's own courtyard, a stable boy had been caught whispering interpretations for a penny apiece. They hanged him with a rope he dreamed would break. Aldrich knelt in the chapel, pressing his forehead to the cold stone floor. He'd written his report on Colin in careful Latin, omitting the part about the tasteless water. The boy would be whipped, not burned. A small mercy. As he rose, his sleeve caught on a splinter in the pew. The tear revealed a scrap of parchment hidden in the lining, a fragment of that banned text he'd copied years ago. A single phrase leaped out. "The dreamer is the unlicensed priest of his own soul." Ah! Aldrich stuffed it back, his pulse rabbiting in his throat. That was the church's true fear. Not demons, not heresy, but the unbearable idea that a man might find divinity without their permission. Outside, the bell tolled for Compline. Somewhere in the village, Colin was listening to the same sound, praying his nightmares wouldn't return. They always did. Chapter 5. Love, Dreams, and Moral Panic. Sister Marguerite woke with a gasp, her thighs pressed together, the echo of a moan still trembling on her lips. The dream clung to her like sweat, so vivid she could still feel the weight of the man's hand on her hip, the scratch of his beard against her neck. Worse yet, she recognized him. It was Brother Thomas, the monastery's new illuminator, whose ink-stained fingers had brushed against hers yesterday when passing the Psalter. She crossed herself violently, as if she could physically wipe away the sin. This was the third time this month. The first dream had been blurry, faceless, just heat and motion. The second had featured the young squire who sometimes delivered firewood. Now, Brother Thomas. At this rate, by Christmas she'd have mentally defiled every man in the diocese. Across the cloister, Brother Thomas was having his own crisis. He dreamed of a woman with Marguerite's sharp cheekbones, but dressed in the green gown of a tavern wench, feeding him grapes one by one, while whispering the Song of Solomon in his ear. He'd woken to find his sheets in a state that required immediate laundering, and penance. Lots of penance. This was the church's dirty secret. Chastity vows didn't stop at the skin. A monk could keep his hands to himself, could fast, could flog his back raw. But no amount of self-discipline could police his dreams. And dreams, as the more paranoid theologians pointed out, were where the devil did his best work. Take the case of Lady Allais. She'd been married to the Baron de Montfort for 12 chaste years, his preferences lying elsewhere, an open secret everyone politely ignored, until she began dreaming of the blacksmith's apprentice. Not just innocent dreams either. Detailed ones, the kind where she could feel the calluses on his palms. After a fortnight of these visions, she'd showed up at the smithy with a loose kirtle and a flimsy excuse about a broken hinge. The apprentice, being no fool and deeply flattered, had obliged. Now Lady Allais was pregnant. The Baron was pretending the child was his, and the village priest was giving sermons about the devil's loophole, the idea that erotic dreams were a back door through which sin could enter, even if the body remained technically pure. The church's solution was equal parts ridiculous and ruthless. Some monasteries mandated sleeping with hands outside the blankets, lest wandering fingers take nocturnal liberties. A particularly zealous abbess in Normandy required her nuns to wear gloves sewn with horsehair, ensuring any nighttime touch would be painfully chaste. For married couples, the advice was simpler: pray harder. And if that didn't work, confess immediately, before the dream could metastasize into action. Brother Aldrich knew all this because he'd been tasked with compiling cases for Bishop Guillaume's upcoming treatise on nocturnal emissions of the soul. It was grim work. Page after page of shamefaced confessions. The deacon who dreamed of being kissed by a statue of the Virgin? The statue's lips had been warm, he insisted. The merchant's wife who kept envisioning her sister's husband. The choir boy who woke screaming about being chased through a forest by a giant, amorous hare. Aldrich's quill hovered over the latest account. A knight squire claimed to have dreamed of lying with his lord's daughter, only to discover, upon waking, a single long blonde hair tangled in his own dark curls. The girl had been visiting her father's castle that very night. The squire had been flogged, the daughter packed off to a nunnery, and the knight had taken to sleeping with a dagger under his pillow, just in case his subconscious needed discouragement. Aldrich set down the quill. His own dreams had been mercifully free of carnal cant lately, unless one counted the recurring vision of Widow Marta Force, feeding him honey cakes while straddling his lap, which he very much did. He'd taken to chewing bitter herbs before bed, hoping their astringent taste would sour any sweet dreams. But the most troubling case came from a tiny village near the German border. A young bride named Gisela had begun sleepwalking to her childhood sweetheart's house, 2 miles away, arriving with her feet bloody from the journey, but her body enthusiastic. She remembered nothing upon waking. Her husband, a superstitious sort, had tied a bell around her ankle each night. When it jingled at midnight, he'd follow the sound to find her straddling the bemused farmhand, both of them still technically asleep. The local priest declared it a case of incubus possession. The farmhand, once he stopped blushing, said it was the best haunting had ever experienced. Gisela's husband opted for a more practical solution. He moved them to a town with a sturdy lock on the door. Aldrich rubbed his temples. The real horror wasn't that people dreamed of illicit love. It was that sometimes the dreams were better than their waking lives. Sister Marguerite would never know a lover's touch. Lady Allais would return to her sham marriage, and Gisela would wake each morning with unaccountably sore muscles and a husband who glared at her over breakfast. Only in sleep could they claim what daylight denied them. No wonder the Church was so determined to regulate it. As Aldrich blew out his candle that night, he wondered if Bishop Guillaume's treatise would mention the most dangerous possibility of all, that these dreams weren't temptations, but truths the soul couldn't bear to speak aloud. Across the diocese, Marguerite lay rigid in her cot, praying for dreamless sleep. Instead, she got Brother Thomas again, this time with paintbrushes involved. Somewhere, a demon was laughing. Chapter 6. Dream Feuds, when sleep brought vengeance. The blood feud between the de Vexin and Montclair families began, as so many great tragedies do, with a bad piece of cheese. Old Baron de Vexin had dreamed one night of choking on a wedge of mouldy brie, while his neighbor, Lord Montclair, stood over him laughing. When he woke coughing, his throat inexplicably raw, he took it as divine warning. That very afternoon, he refused Montclair's customary gift of autumn cheeses. The insult festered. Montclair, in turn, dreamed 3 nights later of de Vexin poisoning his well. By morning, he'd doubled the guard on his water supply. What might have remained petty aristocratic sniping turned deadly when young Philippe de Vexin woke screaming from a vision of Montclair's eldest son pushing him from the castle ramparts. The boy was 12. The fall in his dream had been so vivid he'd wet the bed. When his father found him trembling in sodden sheets, he took it as prophecy rather than nightmare. The first killing happened on St. Brice's feast day. A Montclair huntsman was found with his throat slit near the disputed borderlands, a wedge of cheese stuffed in his mouth. The Divexans denied involvement, but everyone knew. The language of dreams had become the currency of vengeance. Brother Aldrich first heard the confession of a Montclair stable boy who dreamed of setting the Divexan stables ablaze. The boy swore he'd never act on it, but the next week 3 prize warhorses burned alive in their stalls. The boy's corpse was found in the river with stones in his pockets, a precaution taken by his own family. In the village below the Warring Manors, the butcher's wife dreamed her neighbor had cursed her chickens. She woke to find the coop empty, every bird gone. The neighbor swore innocence, but 2 days later, the butcher's wife slit open the neighbor's prized sow in retaliation. It didn't matter that the original chickens were later found roosting in a nearby oak. The dream had been more real than reality. Aldrich documented case after case in his growing manuscript. The miller who dreamed his apprentice was stealing flour and cut off the boy's hand, only to find the real thief had been rats all along. The knight who abandoned his post because he'd foreseen his own death at that spot in a dream, leading to the very massacre he'd envisioned when the enemy found the gate unmanned. Most troubling was the account from a hospice where plague victims' final dreams were recorded. One dying woman whispered of seeing her daughter murdered by the town midwife. The daughter was perfectly healthy, but when the story spread, the midwife was dragged from her home and drowned before anyone thought to question whether plague visions held the same weight as sleeping dreams. The bishop's solution was to declare any violent dream inspired by demons, and therefore inadmissible as justification for action. This edict lasted exactly 1 night, until the bishop himself dreamed his deacon was plotting to poison him. The deacon disappeared the next day. In the monastery library, Aldrich discovered an even more disturbing pattern. Some dreams weren't just predicting violence, they were causing it across distances. 2 merchants who'd quarreled at a summer fair reported identical dreams months later of strangling each other, neither knowing the other had the same vision. A Montclair archer and a Vexen sentry independently described a phantom battle where they'd slain each other with the same oak branch sharpened into a spear. The final horror came when Aldrich interviewed a captured Vexen armsman. The man described dreaming of a battle at the old oak crossroads. "I saw my death clear as day, a Montclair arrow through the eye. When the armies accidentally met at that very spot weeks later, the armsman had panicked and loosed his crossbow too soon, killing a Montclair squire, whose grieving brother then fired the fatal arrow exactly as foreseen." That night, Aldrich dreamed of his own death for the first time. He stood in the monastery chapel as a hooded figure drove a knife between his ribs. The strange part wasn't the pain. It was the certainty that this hadn't happened yet, but would. When he woke, he found a fresh knife wound on his torso. The feud ended, as these things do, in mutual destruction. The last Vexen and Montclair heirs killed each other on All Souls' Night, each having dreamed the encounter for a week straight. Their corpses were found exactly as they'd described to their servants, tangled together in the mud, the Vexen's dagger in the Montclair's gut, the Montclair's sword through the Vexen's heart. At the joint funeral, the new bishop preached about the dangers of heeding dreams. Then he quietly asked Aldrich for a private consultation about his own troubling visions of falling from a great height. Aldrich told him to avoid tall buildings. Somewhere in the darkened monastery that night, a monk dreamed of sharpening a very long knife. And in the village below, a baker's daughter woke screaming from a vision of the same knife dripping red on the chapel stones. Chapter 7. The Alchemist's Dream, Knowledge or Madness. The first time Master Theobald dreamed of the Philosopher's Stone, it appeared to him as a ripe peach in the hand of a faceless angel. When he reached for it, the fruit burst open, revealing not flesh and pit, but a pulsing red gem that whispered to him in a language of fire and mercury. He woke with the taste of copper on his tongue, and the formula for transmutation scrawled across his bedchamber walls in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of rising. This was the alchemist's paradox. The line between divine inspiration and dangerous obsession was thinner than gold leaf. The church tolerated their work, if only because bishops hoped one day to gild their cathedrals with alchemical gold. But let an alchemist claim, his knowledge came from dreams rather than scripture or study, and suddenly he was no longer a scholar but a suspect. But Theobald knew this better than most. His predecessor, a wiry old German named Magnus, had been burned not for failed experiments but for his dream journal. The Inquisitors had taken particular offense at an entry describing Christ as the ultimate transmutation, base flesh made divine. They'd missed the poetry in it, only the heresy. Still, Theobald kept dreaming. The second vision came weeks later, a library where books rearranged themselves as he slept, their letters swimming like minnows until they formed recipes for elixirs that could cure leprosy or turn wine into blood. He woke to find his own manuscripts corrupted, margins filled with symbols that hurt to look at, equations that balanced only if you read them backward. His apprentice, a sharp-eyed boy named Felix, swore he'd heard whispering in the workshop that night, though no one else was present. Theobald might have dismissed it as madness had the symbols not worked. A tincture brewed from one of the dream formulas mended a beggar's broken finger in 3 days. Another caused a dead flower to bloom anew, for exactly 13 heartbeats before it crumbled to ash. The local apothecary offered him a small fortune for the recipes. Theobald refused. These were not his secrets to sell. Meanwhile in Paris, the king's alchemist, a paranoid Castilian named Don Enrique, was having visions of his own. His dreams took place in a mirrored labyrinth where every reflection showed him a different version of himself. Younger, older, once even as a woman, all working at the same furnace. The reflections never spoke, but their movements taught him. He woke each morning with new knowledge, how to distill moonlight, how to calcify time, how to extract the scent of nostalgia from old wine. His notebooks filled with sketches of devices that shouldn't function but did. A self-stoking furnace, a still that separated liquids by color rather than density. The king, thrilled by early successes, granted Don Enrique an entire tower for his work. Then the accidents began. A flask of perfected water dissolved a servant's hand to the wrist. A batch of golden pigment turned a scribe's skin permanently amber. When questioned, Don Enrique merely tapped his temple and said, "The dream is still teaching me." Back in Theobald's workshop, the third dream struck like a hammer blow. He found himself standing before a door of black glass, behind which something shifted and sighed. A voice, his own, but layered with countless others, told him the final ingredient for the great work. A king's breath, a saint's last tear, and the dreamer's own willing blindness. He woke screaming, his eyes burning as if seared by smoke. Felix found him clawing at his face, convinced his eyelids had fused shut. They hadn't, but when Theobald looked in the polished steel mirror, his irises had turned the pale gold of weak wine. The church took notice. Bishop Guillaume, still smarting from the Divination Montclair debacle, dispatched Brother Aldrich to investigate. The monk arrived to find Theobald's workshop walls covered in concentric circles of script, the same phrase repeated in Latin, Greek, and something that might have been Enochian. "Till no is to be devoured." Aldrich, who'd been having dreams of his own, a book whose pages turned to molten lead when touched, recognized the look in Theobald's eyes, the desperate hunger of a man who's seen truth and can't unsee it. He'd seen it in Agnes of Metz before they took her to the dungeon, in Colin the shepherd before they whipped the visions out of him. "You must stop," Aldrich said quietly as Felix packed Theobald's contaminated manuscripts into an iron chest. Theobald smiled, his golden eyes catching the light. "I would if I could, but the door is open now, and something is whispering through." That night, Don Enrique, Paris' tower burned. Witnesses swore they saw the flames dance in perfect geometric patterns before the stone itself caught fire. The alchemist's body was never found, though a single page of his journal survived, unscorched. It contained just 4 words. Daydream was hungry. Shemps. Aldrich returned to the monastery with Theobald's case unresolved. As he knelt in the chapel, he realized with dull horror that he was praying to stop dreaming, something he'd never done even during the worst of his demonic visitations. Because this was worse. Demons, he understood. But the vast, intelligent dark behind Theobald's black glass door, that was something else entirely. In his cell that night, Aldrich dreamed of a library where all the books were written in his own hand, though he couldn't read them. A figure in a monk's habit, his own, someone else, stood at a distant desk copying furiously. When Aldrich approached, the figure turned, and he saw it had no face, just a smooth expanse of skin where features should be. In its hand was a quill dripping, not ink, but something dark and viscous that smelled of iron and sulfur. He woke with a start. On his desk, where no parchment had been before, lay a single sheet covered in fresh writing. His own hand. His own Latin. Instructions for turning lead into light. Somewhere in the dark, a door creaked open, and something that had been waiting a very, very long time took its first step through. Chapter 8. Kings who ruled by dreams and fell by them. King Alaric III's reign began with a dream of 3 black swans drowning in a golden moat. His court astrologers, sensing royal displeasure in his morning scowl, hastily declared it an auspicious sign. Black for constancy, gold for prosperity, the number 3 for divine favor. They neglected to mention the drowning part. This proved a fatal oversight when Alaric, based on subsequent nocturnal visions, ordered the moats of all his castles gilded at ruinous expense. The lead-based paint turned the water toxic, killing not only the royal swans but several drunken knights who mistook the shimmering surface for wine. The revolt began when peasants discovered their wells tainted with the same gold wash. History remembers Alaric as the gilded fool, but his true folly lay in consistency. When he dreamed his wife was bearing him a son with lion's paws rather than hands, he had the queen confined to a tower. When he envisioned his chancellor as a serpent coiled around the treasury, he executed the man without trial. By the time he ordered the entire royal forest cut down because the trees whispered treason in their sleep, even his most loyal guards were exchanging glances. His cousin Roderick, who had been having his own prophetic dreams, all featuring himself wearing the crown, took power during what chroniclers politely called the moonlit abdication, when Alaric ran naked through the courtyard screaming about spider silk nooses descending from the stars. Roderick's first act was to ban dream interpretation at court. His second was to marry Alaric's now mad widow, who promptly gifted him with a son whose slightly elongated fingers became the stuff of uneasy legend. Across the Channel, Queen Mathilde of Varenkia built her entire foreign policy on one particularly vivid dream of dancing bears wearing papal tiaras. Convinced this foretold a beast pope who would unite the animal kingdom against humanity, she diverted her navy to patrol for aquatic heresies among seals and porpoises. Her neglected borders collapsed when the real threat. Her brother-in-law's mercenary army marched unimpeded across undefended farmland. The tragedy of dream rulers wasn't their credulity, but their selective logic. Duke Orsino the Myopic could dismiss his astronomer's warnings of comet-borne plague, yet acted immediately when he dreamed of a flea wearing his signet ring. The resulting great delousing of 1342 saw half his courtiers shaved bald and scrubbed raw in vinegar, including the visiting princess he'd hoped to marry. She returned home and declared war using the incident as justification, citing grievous humiliation to royal personage. Brother Aldrich discovered the darkest example while compiling records for Bishop Guillaume's failed treatise on onerocriticism and statecraft. Buried in the monastery archives was the account of King Edric the Deluded, whose dreams grew increasingly precise and dangerous. He'd foresee enemy troop movements with uncanny accuracy, but also became convinced certain of his subjects were dream witches sending nightmares to unsee at him. His paranoia birthed the infamous pillow inquisitions, where suspects were strapped to special cots and forced to sleep under observation. Those who cried out or thrashed were declared guilty of nocturnal sedition and hanged with their own bed linens. The kingdom prospered militarily, even as its population dwindled, until one fateful morning when guards found Edric dead in his bed, face frozen in terror, his pillow clutched in hands stiffened by rigor mortis. The court physician declared it an excess of melancholic humors, but servants whispered about the 8 distinct handprints, none matching the king's, found pressed into the royal mattress that morning. Even successful rulers fell prey to unironical hubris. Emperor Constantine the Dreamer conquered 3 kingdoms using intelligence gathered from his visions, only to lose them all when he became obsessed with the recurring dream of a city built entirely of sleeping faces. He spent his final years draining the treasury to construct this Honorapolis in the desert, complete with towers shaped like closed eyes and streets paved with engraved eyelids. The project collapsed, literally, when the sand beneath it shifted, swallowing hundreds of workers in what rival empires called divine mockery. The lesson was clear. Dreams made terrible counselors but excellent usurpers. Every court in Christendom had its share of royal oniromancers, advisors who claimed to interpret monarchs' dreams while actually steering them toward sensible policies. The smart ones knew to couch their advice in symbolic flattery. When young King Louis the Tremulous dreamed of mice eating his crown, his quick-witted dream reader declared, "Sire, this means your people shall consume your glory through taxes." The resulting levies funded a war that tripled Louis' territory. Aldrich closed the crumbling chronicle with a shudder. He'd been having increasingly vivid dreams of his own lately, not of kings and kingdoms, but of the monastery corridors stretching endlessly, of books that rearranged themselves when unobserved, of a version of himself who never woke from sleep. The worst part wasn't the visions, but the creeping suspicion that they weren't warnings. They were instructions. Somewhere in the night, a queen dreamed of a monk setting fire to a library. In another castle, a pretender to the throne envisioned Aldrich's face on coins. And deep below the earth, in a place that existed only when certain stars aligned, something that had been dreaming for a very long time began to stir. For now, the kings and queens continued their fatal dance with visions. The astrologers kept their jobs. The courtiers kept their heads down. And the dreams, patient as tides, kept whispering. Chapter 9. Dreambread. Hallucinogens in medieval sleep. The village of Saint-Antonin became famous for 3 things: its unusually fertile wheat fields, its disturbingly vivid dreams, and the fact that every inhabitant over the age of 30 had at least one missing finger. Brother Aldrich first heard the rumors from a traveling spice merchant who claimed the villagers could predict storms days in advance, not by observing the sky but by interpreting their nightmares. Old Martha had a dream about dancing eels, the merchant whispered over a cup of suspiciously fragrant wine. And the next week, the river flooded so high it carried away 3 outhouses. They call it St. Antonin's foresight. When Aldrich arrived in the village during the lean months of early spring, he found a community gripped by equal parts pride and paranoia. The dreams had grown stronger lately, people confessed in hushed tones. More detailed. More dangerous. The baker, a hulking man missing his left pinky and ring finger, explained it best while kneading dough with his remaining digits. Used to be just odd visions, your dead granny knitting with snakes, that sort of thing. Lately, Father Gaspar dreamed his own teeth were growing into his brain, and 2 days later, young Luke bites into an apple and finds his molars fused together like barnacles. He wiped flour-streaked hands on his apron. We don't talk about the finger dreams. Aldrich soon discovered why. The village's missing digits weren't lost to farm accidents or frostbite as he'd assumed. They'd been ritually severed after certain recurring nightmares, the ones where people saw their own hands turning against them, fingers becoming worms or knives or worse. Old Marth, now down to thumb and forefinger on each hand, claimed it was the only way to break the dream's hold before it became real. The truth, as Aldrich pieced together from crumbling herbals and the village midwife's drunken confessions, lay in the rye fields. Saint Antonine's famous fertility came from a peculiar mold that flourished in their grain stores. A grayish growth villagers called sleep flour and secretly added to their bread when supplies ran low. It made the dough rise higher, stretched meager harvests further, and brought dreams so vivid they etched themselves into waking life. The midwife, a sharp-tongued woman named Johann, with only her thumbs intact, demonstrated by feeding a bit of suspect bread to a chicken. Within minutes the bird was pecking at invisible foes, then collapsed into twitching slumber. "Grandmother's recipe," she said proudly as the chicken's legs spasmed. "Same as they used during the Great Famine, when hungry folk needed dreams full of feasts." Aldrich's investigation might have ended there. Another curious footnote for Bishop Guillaume's files. Had he not sampled the bread himself? The dream came like a hammer blow. He stood in a vast library where the books bled ink when touched. A figure in monk's robes, his own, another's, stood at the far end, copying text from a volume that screamed when opened. Aldrich tried to run, but his feet had rooted to the floor like wheat stalks. The monk turned, revealing a face that kept shifting. First Theobald the Alchemist's golden eyes, then Agnes of Metz's bruised mouth, finally settling into a perfect mirror of Aldrich's own features, except for the lips, which were sewn shut with what looked like. He woke choking on the taste of copper and mold. His hands, when he held them up to the weak dawn light, seemed normal at first. Then the little finger on his left hand twitched independent of the others, a sly, knowing movement, as if it had plans of its own. By noon, half the village had gathered to watch Aldrich's dream sickness progress. His left hand kept performing small acts of rebellion, untying his sandal, spilling his inkpot, once even attempting to sign the cross backward. Old Martha nodded sagely and offered her bone saw. It was Johann who provided the alternative. "There's an antidote," she admitted, eyeing Aldrich's treacherous hand. "But it requires sober waking for 3 days straight. No sleep means no dream holds power over you." She gestured to the dark circles under her own eyes. "Why do you think I drink?" Aldrich spent the next 72 hours in agonized wakefulness, drinking bitter herbal brews that turned his tongue black while the midwife and baker took turns slapping him when he nodded off. On the second night, his left hand tried to strangle him in his sleep. Poor would have, had Johann not been vigilant with her leather strap. When the ordeal ended, his hand lay docile in his lap, its mutiny quelled. The villagers celebrated with a feast featuring conspicuously unleavened bread. Only then did the baker reveal the darkest truth. Sometimes the dreams don't leave when you stop eating the bread. Sometimes linger. He pointed to a gaunt man in the corner, eyes darting like trapped birds. Young Henri there hasn't touched dream bread in 10 years. Still swears he's being followed by a version of himself made entirely of teeth. Aldrich returned to the monastery with 2 fewer fingers, precautionary amputations the villagers insisted upon, a sack of contaminated rye for study, and a gnawing suspicion that his own visions weren't entirely natural. The library dreams had started before Saint Antonin, yes, but had they always been his own? That night, unable to sleep for the 3rd time since his return, Aldrich caught a glimpse of movement in his cell's darkest corner. Not a rat or trick of the light, but something roughly man-shaped if men could be woven from shadows and the space between thoughts. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Because suddenly Aldrich remembered. He'd seen it before. In the village, watching from the rye fields, standing behind old Marty as she sawed off another finger. And worst of all, he was almost certain it had been wearing his face. Chapter 10. The Dream Inquisition. When Father Reynard established the office of Oniric Purity in the autumn of 1382, the proclamation nailed to cathedral doors across the diocese contained only 7 words: Tell your dreams. Prove your loyalty. At first, peasants approached the new dream confessors with cautious curiosity. Old women recounted visions of deceased relatives, asking for warmer shrouds. Farmers described anxieties about blighted crops given form as rotting giants stomping through their fields. The confessors nodded, made notes, and sent them away with a light penance. 3 Hail Marys, perhaps a suggestion to avoid rich meats before bed. Then the questions began. Who else appeared in this dream of your grandmother? A confessor might ask, quill poised over parchment. Did she criticize the church? Mention any unbaptized infants? Or more dangerously, this giant, what color were its eyes? Did it speak? Or what exactly did it say about the harvest? Brother Aldrich first witnessed the process when summoned to document the case of a wool merchant's wife who'd made the fatal mistake of confessing a dream about flying over the city. Not as a bird or angel, but as herself, arms outstretched, skirts billowing, while people below threw stones that never quite reached her. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Who taught you to fly in this dream? No one, Father. I simply floated. Floating is a known heresy of the Cathars, who introduced you to their doctrines. By midnight, the woman had been pressed into naming 3 neighbors as possible heretics, all because one had once loaned her a spoon, and another's cat had stared at her in an uncanny manner. The third was a blind beggar who supposedly muttered in his sleep about wings of fire. Aldrich's quill hesitated over that last detail. The woman hadn't mentioned the beggar's dreams until the hot irons were produced. The office's methods grew more sophisticated as winter set in. Suspects were deprived of sleep for days, then encouraged to nap in special devotion chairs that pinned them in place. Interrogators watched for signs of demonic influence, twitching eyelids, rapid breath, the wrong kind of moans. One particularly zealous examiner kept a ledger of suspicious dreamers categorized by theme. Category 3: Dreamers of flight, potential witches. Category 4: Dreamers of forbidden knowledge, alchemy sympathizers. Category 7: Dreamers who see their own faces, likely possessed. The last entry sent a chill down Aldrich's spine. He'd been having those dreams for months. The real horror, however, lay in the office's secondary function. Not content with rooting out dangerous dreams, Father Reynard's men began planting them. Prisoners kept in the special dream cells, windowless rooms where the walls were painted with hypnotic spirals, reported identical visions after 3 days. A black bull with a man's face whispering secrets in a language that itched inside the skull. Aldrich discovered the mechanism while inventorying confiscated goods. Hidden among the heretic's belongings was a small clay vessel containing a dried fungus that, when burned, produced thick smoke with a cloying sweetness. The office's examiners were seeding dreams, then punishing people for having them. His investigation might have ended there had he not made the mistake of mentioning his findings to Brother Lucien, who promptly dreamed of Aldrich consorting with the Black Bull. The accusation came at dawn, delivered by armed guards, who clearly expected resistance. They didn't find Aldrich in his cell. They did, however, find his journal, left conspicuously open to a page detailing Father Reynard's own suspicious dream habits, including the bishop's recurring nightmare about being judged by a jury of his own victims, all holding fragments of the same broken mirror. The Office of Oniric Purity was quietly disbanded the following spring. Father Reynard retired to a seaside abbey, where the crashing waves, he claimed, kept him dreamless. The prisoners were released with stern warnings against imaginative excess. But in villages across the diocese, people now eyed their neighbors differently. A man who mentioned strange dreams over supper might find his beer untouched afterward. Lovers stopped sharing their nocturnal visions, lest a careless word about flying or fire become evidence later. As for Aldrich, he took to sleeping with a wax tablet by his bed, not to record his dreams, but to smooth them away before they could be used against him. It worked, for the most part, except on nights when he woke to find the tablet already filled with writing not his own. A single sentence, always the same. Own way, remember what you try to forget. Visitations, Chapter 11. Monastic Dream Journals, Piety or Subversion. Brother Arnulf's dream journal should have been burned with his bones. That was the general consensus when the old monk finally died after 83 years of dutifully recording every nocturnal vision, from prophetic flashes to embarrassingly detailed fantasies about the kitchen maid, deceased these 40 years. The abbot ordered the heavy volume locked away in the forbidden archives, where only senior brothers might consult it for signs of divine messages or heretical leanings. Aldrich first encountered the journal while searching for references to dream bread in the monastery's records. What he found instead was something far more dangerous: 4 generations of monks whispering across time through their shared dreams. Arnulf's earliest entries were pious enough. Visions of saints, anxieties about unfinished prayers, given form as tangled rosaries, choking him in his sleep. Then around his 30th year, the tone shifted. Dreamt again of the library beneath the library. He'd scrawled in ink that still looked fresh after decades. Brother Simon was there, though he died before my birth. Showed me a book bound in what I fear was human skin. The text kept rearranging itself into the same phrase. "By the dream is the truest confession." Aldrich nearly dropped the brittle pages. He'd seen that library in his own dreams, with the same long-dead brother Simon, who in Arnulf's description wore the distinctive scar across his forehead from the same fall Aldrich had read about in the monastery's chronicles. The implications sent him digging through other journals in the restricted collection. Brother Godric's account from a century prior described being guided through a celestial vineyard by a faceless monk who matched Arnulf's description perfectly. Young Brother Thomas's recently confiscated diary contained sketches of a dark corridor lined with doors, one of which he claimed opened onto Aldrich's own cell on the night of last winter's terrible storm. This wasn't just record-keeping. This was correspondence. The real shock came when Aldrich discovered the hidden system. Certain passages in the journals contained odd flourishes, a letter subtly enlarged here, an unusual spacing there. Read vertically, they formed words, then phrases, then unmistakable messages. Que third celestaire is loose. The rose window faces the wrong sunrise. We remember what they burn. It was a conspiracy of dreamers spanning generations, passing secrets along a chain of sleep. Aldrich might have dismissed it as coincidence had he not, that very night, dreamed of the cellar stair. In the dream, he pried it up to find a cavity containing a single yellowed page from Arnulf's journal that he'd never seen away. It described a vision of the Black Death that had the taste of spoiled honey, and a list of names, including Aldrich's own, written decades before his birth. He woke with a start, his mouth flooded with the cloying taste of rotting sweetness. On impulse he crept to the cellar. The third stair did indeed wobble. Beneath it lay not a page, but a small iron key, and a scrap of parchment with one word in Thomas's handwriting. God. The abbey's great rose window faced west, as it always had, but at dawn the next morning, Aldrich watched as light struck the stained glass at an impossible angle, casting a distorted version of the window's pattern onto the opposite wall. The colored beams formed a map of the monastery's underground passages, with one addition: a chamber beneath the library no official plan acknowledged. That was when Aldrich understood the true purpose of the dream journals. They weren't just records. They were bait. Each generation's most sensitive monks, the ones prone to vivid dreams, the ones who saw patterns in randomness, were being recruited without their knowledge. The journals trained them to pay attention, to look deeper, to follow the breadcrumb trail of shared visions, all leading to what? Aldrich found his answer in the oldest journal of all, hidden behind a loose stone in the crypt. Brother Alcuin's account from 1123 described being visited in dreams by the sleeper under, a being neither divine nor demonic that had been dreaming the world since before humans named things. The monastery, Alcuin claimed, was built atop one of its lucid places where the veil between waking and dreaming grew thin. The other journal writers had added their own encounters over the centuries. Arnulf's final entry, written in a shaky hand the day before his death, chilled Aldrich to the bone. It is not that we record our dreams. It is that our dreams record us. It watches through our eyes when we sleep. Soon it will wake. Aldrich closed the journal with trembling hands. Outside, the rose window's false sunrise glowed unnaturally bright. Somewhere beneath his feet, in a chamber that didn't officially exist, something shifted in its sleep. That night he began his own journal. Not to record his dreams, but to communicate with the next brother who would inevitably dream of him. The circle had to continue. The warnings had to be passed on. Even if, as he suspected, it was exactly what the sleeper under wanted. Chapter 12. Flying in Sleep, When Dreams Defied Physics. When little Marie de L'Enclos floated 3 feet above her straw mattress, her mother didn't scream. She didn't call for the priest or reach for the holy water. She did what any sensible peasant woman would do. She grabbed her daughter's ankle and yanked her back to earth with a thud that woke the chickens. The problem wasn't that Marie had been flying in her sleep. The problem was that she'd been doing it wrong. Proper flying dreams stay in the head, her mother scolded as she tied Marie's left big toe to the bedpost with twine, a common preventative measure. The body stays put. That's how God intended it. Marie's offense was more than just theological. Levitation violated every law medieval physics held dear. Heavy things fell. Light things rose. People, unless they were saints exhibiting miraculous piety or witches consorting with the devil, did neither. And yet, all across Europe, bodies kept betraying this fundamental order in their sleep. Brother Aldrich first encountered the phenomenon while cataloging cases for Bishop Guillaume's abandoned treatise. In a village near Cluny, 3 separate families reported finding their sleepwalking relatives hovering near the rafters like grotesque puppets. A shepherd near Avignon woke mid-air to discover his sheep staring up at him in judgment. Most troubling was the account from a monastery in the Rhineland, where an entire dormitory of monks had risen simultaneously during a full moon, their snoring bodies bumping against the ceiling, like balloons in a draft, according to the sole awake witness, a young novice who promptly renounced his vows. The church's position was characteristically contradictory. St. Joseph of Cupertino's well-documented levitations were celebrated as divine gifts. When a tailor's apprentice near Toulouse exhibited the same ability, it earned him a trial for witchcraft. The difference, as always, came down to paperwork. Saints had official permission to break natural law. Aldrich discovered the darker truth while investigating the case of Bertrand the floating cobbler, a mild-mannered shoemaker whose nocturnal aerial displays had become something of a local spectacle. Neighbors paid in eggs or firewood to watch him sleep, hovering a hand's breadth above his cot while mumbling about the warm winds. The bishop's men only intervened when Bertrand began rising higher, once getting tangled in the rafters and waking with splinters in unmentionable places. "It's not the flying that worries them," Bertrand whispered to Aldrich as they examined the special weighted blanket the church had mandated he sleep under. "It's what we might see up there." That night, Aldrich understood. He dreamed of standing on the monastery roof, then stepping off. Instead of falling, he floated upward, the ground shrinking away until the entire abbey lay below him like a child's toy. From this height, he noticed unsettling details. The cloister garden formed a perfect octagon that shouldn't have been visible from ground level. The cemetery headstones all leaned slightly northwest, as if pointing to something beyond the hills. Most disturbing, the famous rose window wasn't where it should be, its glowing colors now clearly visible on the north wall rather than west. He woke gasping, his body pressed flat against the ceiling, dust from the rafters coating his tongue. The fall back to his bed cracked a rib. The official records called such incidents nocturnal hysteria or vaporous imbalance. The unofficial solution, employed by everyone from peasants to princes, involved weighted night clothes, ankle restraints, and in extreme cases, sleeping in specially constructed cages. Duchess Isabel of Burgundy famously took this to extremes, commissioning an elaborate ironwork canopy bed to keep both virtue and body earthbound. Her husband, who dreamed exclusively of falling into cellars, needed no such precautions. But the most effective prevention came from an unexpected source. Aldrich discovered a marginal note in an old bestiary suggesting swallows' nests placed under the pillow could cure aerial afflictions. Skeptical but desperate after his own levitation episode, he tried it. That night, he dreamed not of flying, but of running. Endlessly, exhaustingly, through a forest where the trees grew upside down, roots clawing at a sky that pulsed like a living thing. He woke aching but grounded. The remedy worked because it replaced one unnatural dream with another, Aldrich realized. The human mind, it seemed, could only defy so many laws of nature at once. This theory was tested dramatically when young Marie de L'Enclos, now 14 and still prone to midnight floats, was brought to the monastery after her mother's death. The monks rigged a clever system of counterweights and pulleys above her bed, allowing her to rise safely while tethered. Night after night, she ascended like a strange angel, murmuring descriptions of what she saw in her dreams. The river's shaped like a noose from up here. There's a light in the old oak where the owl lives. No, not a light, a hole. Brother Aldrich, why does your shadow have wings? The abbot ordered the experiment stopped after Marie described seeing the sleeper's face in the pattern of plowed fields. That same night, every swallow in the monastery vanished from their nests. Aldrich found the birds days later in the crypt, dead and arranged in a perfect spiral around Brother Alcuin's tomb. Their tiny skulls had been emptied, not by predators, but by something with surgical precision. As he knelt to investigate, a gust of wind from nowhere stirred the feathers. Aldrich's hand flew to his rosary, but the true horror came later that night when he dreamed not of flying, but of watching himself sleep, from high above through dozens of tiny, black, unblinking eyes. Chapter 13. The Night Hag. Medieval sleep paralysis. The first time it happened to Brother Aldrich, he thought he was dying. One moment he lay in his cell, drifting towards sleep. The next, a crushing weight on his chest, iron fingers around his throat, the sour stench of rotting flowers filling his nose. His limbs refused to obey. His prayers stuck in his paralyzed throat. Only his eyes could move, rolling frantically until they focused on the figure straddling him. A woman-shaped shadow with fingers too long, a mouth too wide, and eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. She leaned close, her breath like damp earth, and whispered his name in a voice made of broken harp strings. Then, as suddenly as it began, the spell broke. Aldrich gasped upright, clutching his throat. His cell stood empty. The door remained barred from within. Only the indentation on his mattress, as if invisible knees had pressed into the straw, suggested anything had happened at all. The night hag had visited. Old Brother Gaspar nodded knowingly when Aldrich described his experience at dawn prayer. "Aye, she comes for the dream touched," he wheezed, making the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. "Sits on your chest to steal your breath. The Welsh call her Hadizes. The Norse say Marai. We've 100 names for her because she's been here since before names existed." Gaspar's explanation followed the church's official stance. The night hag was a lesser demon, sent to test the faithful with nocturnal oppression. The prescribed remedies were standard: holy water under the bed, a wax crucifix worn around the neck, a thorough confession to eliminate any spiritual vulnerabilities she might exploit. But as Aldrich dug deeper into the monastery's records, he found discrepancies. The hag appeared too consistently across too many cultures to be purely demonic. Pagan charms against her worked as well as Christian prayers. A Jewish physician's manuscript described the exact same phenomenon, attributing it to an imbalance of humors during the night watch. Most tellingly, the descriptions never varied. The crushing weight, the paralysis, the malevolent presence, even across people who'd never exchanged stories. The truth revealed itself in fragments. A marginal note in a 12th century psalter described a monk waking to find his own hands moving independently. Yes, if a puppeteer sat upon my breast. A laundress' testimony to an Inquisition claimed the hag had shown her future events that later came true. Young Marie de L'Enclos, still residing at the monastery after her levitation episodes, reported the most chilling detail. "She doesn't come from outside," the girl whispered. "She comes up from underneath, like something pushing through a thin spot." Aldrich's breakthrough came during a visit to the monastery's infirmary, where he discovered an ancient Greek text hidden between the pages of a herbal. The physician Galen described a condition called Defied, nightmare so vivid the sleeper believes themselves awake, paralyzed by the body's natural humors settling wrongly. The description matched Aldrich's experience perfectly. This should have comforted him. Scientific explanations always did. But then why, during his next episode, did the hag whisper something only his dead mother would know? Why did victims across Europe report hearing prophecies in that rasping voice? And why, when Aldrich finally managed to croak out a prayer during an attack, did the hag laugh with his own laughter before vanishing? The most disturbing account came from a charcoal burner in the nearby woods. The man claimed the hag had visited him every winter since childhood, but last winter something changed. "She didn't just sit on me," he told Aldrich, eyes darting toward the trees. "She reached inside my mouth and pulled something out. A wispy thing, like cobwebs made of smoke, put it in her own mouth and swallowed." He rubbed his throat. "Haven't dreamed since? Not proper dreams, just gray spaces where things move at the edges." Aldrich might have dismissed this as superstitious rambling, had he not found similar reports in the forbidden archives. A nun's diary described being emptied of dreams after a particularly violent hag attack. A troubadour's song told of a knight left, soulless, after the hag drank his night thoughts. Most chilling was a scrap of parchment hidden in Brother Alcum's journal, written in a shaky hand. "She is not the danger. She is the warning. Something hungrier watches through her eyes. Erdian, Noils, Mosan." That night, Aldrich prepared as if for battle. He lit every candle he could scavenge. He hung iron nails over his bed, an old pagan charm he'd never admit to using. He even tied one wrist to the bedpost with coarse rope, hoping the pain might anchor him to wakefulness. None of it worked. She came just before midnight. The candles guttered out one by one as the pressure built on Aldrich's chest. This time, he could move his eyes enough to see the rope hanging limp. His wrist had slipped free without untying the knot. The hag's face hovered inches from his own, her features shifting like smoke. First a crone, then a beautiful maiden, then for one heart-stopping moment, his own face mirrored back at him. "You keep looking outward," she whispered, her breath stinking of turned earth. "But the door opens inward." Her fingers pressed against his eyelids. "Shall I show you?" Aldrich woke screaming, his fingers clawing at his face. The other monks found him on the floor, his cell in disarray, his fingernails bloody from scratching at the walls. Only later, when the panic subsided, did he notice the marks on his chest, not bruises from imagined pressure, but 8 perfect fingerprints burned into his skin, as if by frost. And stranger still, he couldn't remember his dreams anymore. Not a single one since the attack. Just a lingering sense that something stood just beyond sight, waiting for him to close his eyes again. The abbot ordered special prayers, said over Aldrich's bed. The infirmarian prescribed a sleeping draught. Young Marie de L'Enclos, now the only person he trusted, slipped him a different remedy, a swallow's feather sewn into a tiny leather pouch. "She can't steal what you don't have," the girl whispered cryptically. That night, Aldrich slept without dreams, without visitations. But somewhere in the dark, something that had been feeding on his nightmares for months let out a soundless scream of frustration and began looking for tastier prey. Chapter 14. Dreaming in Plague Times. The first sign that the plague dreams were different came when two strangers, a Venetian merchant and a Breton farmer's wife, described the same nightmare on the same night, though neither had ever traveled beyond their villages. Both spoke of a field of black roses that wept thick, honey-colored tears. Both woke with their pillows crusted in the same foul amber residue, their throats raw as if they had been screaming for hours. By the time Brother Aldrich heard of it, the phenomenon had spread. A weaver in Lyon dreamed of a faceless physician who peeled back his skin to reveal plague buboes, shaped like tiny, screaming faces. A nun in Avignon saw the Virgin Mary turn away from her outstretched hands, whispering, "Jeven, I cannot looking." A child in a quarantined household woke his parents by reciting the names of every person who would die in their street over the next fortnight, his small voice eerily calm, as if reading from a ledger. The church declared these visions either divine warnings or demonic deceptions, depending on who described them. The people who actually suffered the dreams knew better. These were not messages. They were infections. Aldrich discovered the truth when he volunteered to tend the sick at St. Valentine's Hospice. The dying did not dream of judgment or paradise, but of a vast library where every book bore a human name. Pages turned themselves slowly, each one blackening at the edges as the patient's fever rose. Some claimed to hear whispering from the shelves, not in any language they knew, but in a crawling, clicking speech that made their teeth ache. Then the healers began catching the dream sickness. Aldrich watched as Sister Marguerite, who had nursed plague victims for 3 months without falling ill, woke one morning, convinced her shadow had detached itself during the night. "It stands in the corner when I sleep," she told him, her usually steady hands trembling around her rosary. "Last night it put its fingers in my mouth. I can still taste the rot." Within a week she was dead, not from plague, but from throwing herself down the hospice stairs, to escape something only she could see. They found her body twisted at an impossible angle, her face frozen in a smile of relief. The worst were the shared nightmares. Aldrich witnessed 2 dying men, strangers from different parts of France, converse in their fever dreams, describing the same corridor where the keepers sorted souls like manuscripts on dusty shelves. One man's description of a book with my name written in puss exactly matched another patient's vision from 50 miles away. When Aldrich finally succumbed to the dream plague himself, it began with a smell, not the putrid stench of the hospice, but the crisp, cold scent of parchment and iron gall ink. He stood in a vaulted hall where the shelves stretched endlessly upward, each ledger glowing faintly as if illuminated from within. A figure moved in the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, its fingers trailing over spines as it murmured to itself in that same insect-clicking tongue. Aldrich's ledger sat open on a stone pedestal, its pages half-eaten by some unseen corrosion. The figure approached, running a nail down the entries. "Yours is an interesting case," it said in perfect Latin, though the voice came not from its hidden face, but from the walls themselves. So many dreams stolen, so many nights fed upon. And yet, a finger tapped the newest entry. "You still cling to waking." The words burned themselves into Aldrich's mind, though he couldn't read them. "Somnus non est medicamen." Sleep is not the sickness, but the cure. He woke with a start to find the hospice in chaos. Patients who had been comatose moments before now thrashed and screamed, begging someone to close the books. A young monk ran past with his habit smoking. He'd thrown holy water on a woman who claimed her skin was turning to parchment, only to watch actual blisters form in the shape of letters. In the chapel, Aldrich found the sole undisturbed patient, an old woman who had refused sleep for 5 days. She clutched a crude doll made of bundled herbs, her eyes clear despite the fever spots on her face. "They don't come for those who don't dream," she whispered when he knelt beside her. "But the price is worse." She opened the doll's stitching to show him the interior. Not herbs, but fingernail clippings, teeth, and a lock of hair. "You leave pieces of yourself in the waking world, so nothing can take the rest in sleep." Aldrich thought of the hag's frostbitten fingerprints on his chest, of the swallow feathers Marie had given him, of all the ways humans tried to outwit the dark. That night he did something he hadn't done since childhood. He fought against sleep, pinching his arms, reciting psalms, pacing his cell until his legs gave out. When exhaustion finally claimed him, he dreamed not of libraries or ledgers, but of a vast and silent ocean where something darker than the water watched from below. And for the first time in months, he woke rested. The plague raged on. The dreams grew worse. But in one monastery at least the brothers took up the old woman's practice, sleeping with scraps of their habits tucked under their tongues, with nail parings sewn into their mattresses, with any physical anchor to remind their sleeping minds, this is the real world. It worked. Mostly. Until the night the ledger keeper appeared in Aldrich's cell anyway, its bony fingers tracing the pages of a book that hadn't been there at bedtime. "You can't cheat fate," it whispered, tapping an entry where Aldrich's name appeared in smudged, red ink. "Only delay it." Outside, the first scream of the night rang through the plague-stricken streets. Somewhere, a new patient was dreaming of a library. And the shelves, Aldrich knew, were always hungry for new volumes. Chapter 15. Rebellions Born in Dreams. The peasant revolt began, as most peasant revolts do, with a man who had nothing left to lose. But this one was different. This one had dreamed of fire. Guillaume Michael did not look like a revolutionary when he first stood atop the haycart outside Saint-Cloud-des-Serons, his sunburnt face gaunt from hunger, his hands still blackened with the soil of his dead lord's fields. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was not the usual complaints about taxes or crop failures. It was a dream so vivid, so precise in its imagery, that even the most skeptical farmers leaned in as he spoke. "I saw the angels of the Lord walking through the wheat fields with sickles of flame," Cale declared, his voice cracking like dry earth. "And they cut down not the grain, but the lords who steal it. I saw the chateau burn like kindling, and from their ashes rose black wheat that fed every hungry child for 100 leagues. He raised his hands, still trembling from the vision. And the voice said to me, "Why do you starve when the fire is yours to wield?" It should have been laughed off. The local priest certainly tried, calling it demonic fancy. But the harvest had failed 3 years running. The plague had taken 1 in 3. And dreams, as the desperate know better than anyone, are the last refuge of the powerless. By the time Brother Aldrich heard of the uprising, Cale's ragtag army had swelled to 5,000 souls. Peasants, yes, but also disgraced knights, runaway monks, and even a few minor nobles who claimed to have had the same vision. The Dreamers' Revolt, as it came to be called, moved with eerie precision, striking manors and storehouses in seemingly random order, until Aldrich pieced together the pattern. They were following the exact route from Cale's dream. Aldrich was sent to investigate under the guise of offering spiritual counsel. What he found in the rebels' camp unsettled him far more than the usual revolutionary fervor. These men and women did not drink or carouse like soldiers. They slept. Piles of them, curled together like dogs, their eyelids twitching as they murmured in unison. Cale himself barely stayed awake longer than it took to give orders before collapsing into slumber again. "The dream is spreading," explained a haggard woman stirring a pot of thin gruel. She showed Aldrich her palms, where strange symbols had been carved into the calluses, not by knife, but by her own fingernails during sleep. "Last night I saw the fire angels too. They were handing out swords made of bread." Aldrich soon discovered the terrifying truth. This was no mere metaphor inspiring rebellion. The peasants were literally sharing Cale's dream, night after night, each edition subtly changing the vision. A blacksmith added burning anvils. A shepherdess inserted flocks of fiery sheep. With each retelling, the apocalyptic vision grew more detailed, more visceral, and more inevitable. The Church's response was predictable. Bishop Guillaume declared the dreams heretical fantasies, claiming true divine visions would never encourage disobedience. This backfired spectacularly when 3 of his own clerks deserted to join the rebels, claiming they dreamed of the bishop's mitre transforming into a serpent that devoured the poor. Then the dreams began coming true. Not metaphorically, not as inspirational coincidence. The chateau at Montdidier burned exactly as described in the shared visions, down to the specific tapestry that supposedly caught fire first. A tax collector was found dead, with a loaf of bread stuffed down his throat, precisely as a dozen rebels had dreamed. Most chillingly, a child in the next village accurately drew the face of a lord who wouldn't die for another 3 days, down to the peculiar scar on his forehead from a riding accident no one could have known about yet. Aldrich confronted Cale in his makeshift tent, expecting fanaticism. Instead, he found a terrified man clutching a crude doll made of straw and his own hair. "I never wanted this," the rebel leader whispered. "The dream wasn't mine to begin with. It came from elsewhere. I'm just the loudest dreamer." He showed Aldrich his feet, where the soles were blackened as if walked over coals, injuries that matched none of his waking movements, but exactly fit his dream self's path through flaming fields. The night before the final battle, Aldrich experienced the dream himself. He stood in a cathedral made of charred wheat stalks, where stained glass windows depicted not saints, but starving peasants holding aloft their severed shackles. The altar was a mountain of bread and wine that never dwindled no matter how many hands tore at it. And behind it all, barely visible in the smoke, something enormous shifted. Not a face, not a form, but the idea of a face, the memory of a form. When the royal forces crushed the revolt at the Battle of Meaux, they expected celebration. Instead, the surviving rebels smiled through their executions, whispering that the dream continued. Cale himself went to the rack, still muttering about the Great Awakening. Back at the monastery, Aldrich discovered the most disturbing detail of all. In the archives, buried beneath accounts of a dozen other rebellions, he found the same pattern. Leaders who dreamed of justice, followers who caught the vision like fever, and always some element that came true with impossible precision. The Jacqueries of 1358 taught a thought. The Stedingers' revolt. The Breton uprising of 1223. All born from dreams that refused to stay contained in sleep. That night, Aldrich burned his notes. Then he took up a quill and began writing in the secret cipher he'd found in Brother Alcuin's journal centuries before. If dreams could spread like plague, then warnings could too. As the first words took shape, "Beware the dream that dreams itself," a cold draught stirred the candle flames. And somewhere in the dark, 1,000 sleeping peasants murmured the same phrase in unison. Chapter 16. The Banned Book of Dream Symbols. The first time Brother Aldrich laid eyes on the Gesumnicon, it was being used to prop up a wobbling table in the monastery kitchen. The heavy leather cover, blackened by years of grease and candle smoke, bore no title, only a faint indentation where brass letters had once been pried away. When he lifted it, the pages exhaled the scent of mildew and something sharper, like crushed nettles. Brother Jerome, the perpetually flustered kitchen master, shrugged when Aldrich asked about it. "Came with that batch of confiscated texts from Toulouse, didn't it? Bishop said burn anything that smelled like heresy, but that one just made the fire smoke purple, so we kept it for kindling." He leaned closer, flour dusting his brows like premature age. "Though I'll say this, Brother Anselm read 3 pages last winter and refused to sleep for a fortnight. Had to tie him to his cot in the end." Aldrich smuggled the book back to his cell under his robes, the weight of it pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The Somnicon was not like other dream manuals. Those tame lists of symbols approved by the church, where dreaming of a falcon meant divine favor, and dreaming of cheese meant you'd eaten cheese. This was something else entirely. The first section appeared harmless enough. Etitosi, a black dog in sleep may portend, but the interpretation spiraled into madness by the third line. Dissolution of boundaries between self and other, particularly if the dog speaks in your mother's voice, or if its shadow moves independent. Note: if the dog is missing its right eye, refer to Chapter 7 regarding holes in the world. Adility. Aldrich spent nights hunched over the crumbling pages, deciphering the cramped Latin, mixed with what appeared to be older, darker languages. The book spoke of shared dream spaces and lucid contagions. It described rituals to enter another's dreams, requiring, among other things, the dreamer's spit and a mirror that had reflected their face at sunset. Most disturbing was Chapter 9, Zon Symbols That Watch Back Eye, which warned that certain dream images could become aware of the dreamer's attention and react accordingly. The previous owner's notes in the margins told their own story. One page bore a frantic sketch of a hand reaching up from the book's gutter, captioned "Einon est in paginas sed inter." It is not on the pages, but between them. Another showed a crude map of the monastery with certain locations marked, including the cellar stair Aldrich had dreamed about months prior. Then there were the stains. Rust-colored fingerprints dotted the sections about prophetic dreams. A sticky residue coated the pages discussing edible symbols. And on the treatise about shared nightmares, Aldrich found a single long black hair embedded in the parchment, too coarse to be human. His first practical experiment came by accident. Reading the passage about doors that open both ways, Aldrich muttered the listed phrase, "Jusum non dormiunt." Dreams do not sleep, just as the monastery bell told midnight. The dream struck like a falling brick. He stood in a vast scriptorium whence copied not books, but the twitching bodies of sleepers onto stretched human skin. The air smelled of ink and spoiled meat. One monk looked up from his work. It was Brother Arnulf, decades dead, his eyes milky with cataracts. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, holding up a quill that wept black tears. "The ledger is almost full." Aldrich woke with the phrase "memento clusionem" carved into his forearm in raised welts. No blood, just angry flesh forming letters. The Uzamnikan lay open on his chest, though he could have sworn he closed it. The page showed a woodcut of a door, with 7 locks, each shaped like a different sleeping face. Underneath, in fresh ink that gleamed wet, though the book was centuries old, someone had added, "1 key per dreamer." Divinity. The abbé's infirmarian declared the marks on Aldrich's arm a humorous imbalance, and prescribed leeches. The other brothers eyed him with uneasy pity, all except young brother Luke, who cornered Aldrich in the cloisters one foggy morning. "You've been reading it too," Luke whispered, rolling up his sleeve to reveal matching marks spelling "care core." "Seek the heart gate. Not just the book, the Uvar book, the one it wants us to find." That was how Aldrich learned about the Azomnicon's missing half, the Ganairothicon, said to contain the rituals to reverse what the first book taught. Legend claimed the 2 volumes had been separated by a 10th century pope, who burned the second half after it made an entire convent scream themselves awake every night for a month. Luke's clues led them to the monastery's oldest wine cellar, where the walls bore the same spiral patterns from the Office of Oneric Purities interrogation chambers. Behind a cask of vinegar-soaked wine, they found a hollow stone containing a single vellum page, the only surviving fragment of the Ganairothicon. The text was almost illegible, eroded by time, and what looked like teeth marks at the edges. But the crucial passage remained. To sever a dream's hold, one must speak its name backward at the hour of its birth while holding something it has touched. Warning: the forgotten will take its place. Abundance. Luke touched the page reverently. "This is how we stop the spread. like cauterizing a wound. Aldrich said nothing. He was too busy staring at the margin where someone, perhaps centuries later, had added 3 words in familiar handwriting. Or feed it. Esistoni, Piety, Nsinteano Kavan. Highlifuno. The handwriting was his own. That night, the dreams changed. The scriptorium became a butcher's shop where Aldrich's memories hung on hooks. His first confession, his mother's funeral, the feel Agnes of Metz wrist as they dragged her away. Brother Arnulf stood at the counter, weighing them on brass scales. Too light, he kept muttering. Not enough to pay the debt. Aldrich woke to find the Yazamnikan, open to a new section he could have sworn wasn't there before. On the consumption of dreams. The ink smelled fresh. The woodcuts showed robed figures feasting on swirling clouds above sleeping victims' heads. At the bottom of the page, in that same too familiar hand. Pongri? In the morning, Brother Luke was found sleepwalking in the crypt, his fingernails torn bloody from scratching at Brother Alcuin's tomb. He claimed something had followed him out of a dream and was now nesting in his shadow. The abbot ordered the Yazamnikan burned again, this time with holy oil and salt. It took 3 days for the fire to finally catch. When it did, the smoke coiled into shapes that several monks swore formed letters. The same phrase Aldrich had carved into his cell wall that night in secret. Zomnia vivunta. A dream sliff. Intendu. And in the ashes, perfectly preserved, lay the single page from the Yoneirothicon. Aldrich pocketed it without thinking, his fingers moving as if guided by something that knew its way around a thief's habits. That night, he dreamed of a great library where all the books were copies of the Yazamnikan, each slightly altered. In one, the woodcuts blinked. In another, the margins dripped. And at the center, on a pedestal of finger bones, lay a volume bound in what looked like tattooed skin, the complete text, both halves reunited. As he reached for it, every Aldrich in every dream looked up from their reading and smiled. He woke with a taste like burnt honey on his tongue, and the absolute certainty that books were not a danger. Readers were. Chapter 17. Doctors who prescribed against dreaming. Brother Aldrich first encountered the Eusomnus sanitatising in the monastery infirmary while searching for a remedy for his persistent cough. The hefty medical tome lay open to a page bearing a vivid illustration of a man sleeping in the approved posture. Flat on his back with arms crossed over his chest like a corpse in state, while demons wept in frustration around him. The caption read, "Proper alignment prevents oniric infiltration." The text below was worse. To preserve the humors and guard against dangerous dreams, it declared, the wise physician shall prescribe thusly. No root vegetables after sunset, lest they ferment in the belly and birth. Chimeric visions. Cheese may be taken sparingly, except during waning moons, when it becomes a conduit for incubi. Sleeping on... Aldrich flipped to another section, where a grimacing physician administered a dream-suppressing enema of vinegar and ground pearls. A marginal note in a later hand added, for stubborn cases, replace pearls with powdered raven skull, but expect screaming. Brother Infirmarian caught him reading it and chuckled. We still follow some of those prescriptions, Sister Marguerite. He nodded toward the old nun grinding herbs in the corner. Won't let anyone sleep with their feet facing west after sunset. Claims it makes the dreams slithery. Indeed, the monastery was full of such precautions. Brother Jerome in the kitchen refused to serve mushrooms on Fridays after a nightmare about Satan serving him a fungal communion wafer. The abbot slept with a bag of salt under his pillow, a practice he'd learned from a Jewish physician in Montpellier. Even young Marie de L'Enclos, still living at the monastery years after her levitation episodes, had taken to wearing gloves sewn with dried peas after dreaming her fingernails, whispered treasonous verse. Aldrich's skepticism lasted exactly one night, the night he made the mistake of eating onions with his supper before reading the Gesomnus Sanitatis entry on alliums. His dreams that night were a parade of horrors. A marketplace where butchers sold glistening slabs of human memory, a chapel where the stained glass depicted his own face aging backward into infancy, and worst of all, a vast underground river where something enormous moved just beneath the dark water, its shape suggesting impossible anatomy. He woke screaming, his pillow soaked with sweat, and his mouth tasting of soil, as if he'd been screaming directly into the earth. The infirmarian took one look at him, and handed over a tincture of poppy and vervain. "Onion dreams," he said knowingly. "Should have warned you. They're worse for celibates, something about unspent humors." But the Gesomnus Sanitatis held darker wisdom than mere dietary advice. Its final chapter, Ade de Somniis Mortuis, on dead dreams, described patients who had somehow ceased producing dreams altogether. These unfortunates, the text claimed, would sleep soundly for months or years until one night they simply failed to wake. Their bodies lived on, breathing, even digesting food if carefully spoon-fed. But behind their eyelids, something else looked out. "Your dreamless are not empty," the passage warned. "Ye are occupied." Aldrich might have dismissed this as medieval superstition had he not already met one such patient, a wool merchant's son in Toulouse who had stopped dreaming after a fever. The boy's family claimed he now slept like the dead, never stirring except to occasionally whisper numbers in an unknown language. When Aldrich visited, the boy's eyes had flown open the moment he crossed the threshold, though the family swore he hadn't woken in weeks. Those eyes, glassy and too knowing, had followed Aldrich's every move until he fled. The infirmarian confirmed the worst. "We've 3 brothers like that in the crypt cells," he admitted, lowering his voice. "Old brother Simon, he's been asleep since before I took vows. Still looks 40, though he should be near 80. Sometimes his lips move like his, conversing with someone. Last winter, young Luke swore he heard Simon recite an entire psalm, in perfect Greek, which Simon never knew." That night, Aldrich took precautions. He ate only plain bread for supper. He positioned his cot due east. He even tried the enema recipe, minus the raven skull, though the vinegar alone produced dreams the brothers politely ignored. The dream came anyway. He stood in a vast hospital where patients dangled in cocoons of sodden sheets, their faces covered by leather masks marked with humoral symbols. A physician in a beak-plagued mask moved between them, tapping each forehead with a silver hammer. Where he struck, the patient's skulls resonated like bells, producing tones that formed words. "Hungry, ni shaman, nederse, Visitations. Hungry, lonely, Einen can't see. It's the enemy." Aldrich's turn came. The hammer descended. His skull sang a note that became a name. Not his own, but something older. Something that made the dream hospital walls bleed black ichor. He woke with the taste of that name on his tongue, though he couldn't recall it. His hands were clasped over his chest in the approved posture from the Gesomnus Sanitatis, and at the foot of his bed sat a single, perfect onion. No one admitted to placing it there. Brother Infirmarian prescribed a week of sleeping upright in the chapel. The abbot suggested exorcism. Young Marie de L'Enclos, now nearly grown and wiser than all of them, pressed a pouch of dried hops into Aldrich's hand. "For dreamless sleep," she whispered. Then, seeing his expression, "Oh, don't worry, they're not really hops." Aldrich never did ask what they were. He simply hung them over his bed and tried not to notice how the shadows around them never quite settled into place, as if avoiding contact. The Gesomnus Sanitatis disappeared from the infirmary the next week. The infirmarian claimed it had been sent to Rome for correction. But Aldrich knew the truth. had hidden it himself behind the same loose stone where Brother Alcuin's journal had once rested. Some books weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be fed. That night, as the monastery slept, something in the crypt shifted under its sheets. Its lips moved silently, forming the name Aldrich's skull had sung. And in his cell, Aldrich slept dreamlessly at last, his face frozen in an expression of perfect, unnatural peace. Chapter 18. Dream Double Agents. Saints versus Sinners. When Lady Marguerite de Bourbon dreamed of a radiant stag that spoke to her in the voice of her deceased father, the Bishop of Clermont declared it a miracle before she had even finished recounting the vision. By week's end, an illuminated manuscript was being prepared, depicting the noblewoman kneeling before the celestial creature, her face bathed in golden light. The stag's words, "The pure shall inherit the kingdom beyond sleep," were embroidered onto altar cloths. Pilgrims began leaving offerings at the site of her dream, a sun-dappled glade on her husband's estate. 3 months later, when a charcoal burner's daughter named Alison described an identical vision, same stag, same words, the same bishop ordered her flogged for witchcraft. The trial record noted that the devil often mimicked holy visions to deceive the lowly, and that the stag in Alison's account had unnatural eyes like a man's. The girl's back bore 30 lashes before dawn. Brother Aldrich witnessed both events. He had been the scribe recording Lady Marguerite's testimony, carefully omitting her mention of the stag's peculiar stench of wet fur and iron. He had also been present when Alison's father came to the monastery gate, begging for someone to examine the marks that had appeared on his daughter's arms after the beating. Crisscrossed welts that formed symbols matching those in Aldrich's forbidden insomnicons. This was the great unspoken truth of medieval dreams. Their meaning depended entirely on who dreamed them. A knight who dreamed of flying was receiving divine favor. A peasant who dreamed the same was learning witchcraft. A nun's erotic dream was the devil's temptation. A noble woman's identical vision was a mystical marriage to Christ. Aldrich documented case after case in his growing collection of forbidden observations. The merchant's son whose prophetic dreams of shipwrecks made him a sought-after advisor to trading companies, while the fisherman who predicted the same disasters was accused of weather magic. The abbot who dreamed of a naked woman bathing in a fountain and declared it an allegory for the church's purity, while a novice describing the same vision was assigned 6 months of silent penance. Most infuriating was the case of 2 women in the same village, the wealthy widow Madame Carpentier and the goose-girl Lisette, who both dreamed of a black dog bringing them messages from the dead. The widow's visions became famous. Pilgrims paid to touch the pillow where she'd received visits from her departed husband. The goose-girl was drowned after her dreams accurately predicted 3 deaths in the Lord's household. Interpretation is not about truth. Old Brother Gaspar wheezed when Aldrich expressed doubts. It's about order. A lady's dream upholds the world as God made it. A peasant's dream unravels the seams. The system worked perfectly until the dream started fighting back. Lady Marguerite's glorious dark visions turned sinister. The golden light curdled to a sickly yellow. The voice became distorted, her father's words twisting into something that made her wake screaming about bones in the walls. The bishop blamed a demonic envy of her piety and prescribed daily exorcisms. Alison, the charcoal burner's daughter, meanwhile, began experiencing strange reversals. Her nightmares of burning alive became healing visions where the flames soothed rather than consumed. The welts on her back formed patterns that local cunning women swore were protective sigils. When the village priest tried to whip her again, the lash wrapped around his own wrist instead, burning the flesh where it touched. Aldrich began noticing other cases where dreams refused to follow their prescribed roles. A Novgorod merchant's daughter dreamed in perfect church Latin, though she'd never been educated. A leper's apocalyptic visions matched those of an imprisoned heretic word for word, though the two had never met. Most troubling, several noble children began reporting nightmares that exactly replicated the tortures inflicted on local witches, as if their sleeping minds had crossed some forbidden boundary to witness the suffering. The final straw came when Bishop Guillaume himself began dreaming of the charcoal burner's daughter. Not in any lustful or violent way, that might have been understandable, but in mundane scenes of her daily life, gathering firewood, singing to geese, stirring the foul-smelling tar pits. The dreams were so ordinary they became extraordinary in their persistence, appearing night after night with documentary precision. Why would God show me this? The bishop fumed during Aldrich's mandatory visit to bless his chambers. What possible spiritual lesson lies in watching some illiterate chit of a girl skim resin? Aldrich said nothing. He was too busy staring at the bishop's bed curtains, where someone had embroidered a tiny black stag in an obscure corner, the same unnatural eyes Alison had described. That night, Aldrich dreamed of the stag for the first time. It stood knee-deep in a river that flowed both ways simultaneously, its golden fur matted with what looked like ink. "Your dream knows the dreamer," it said in the bishop's voice. "But the dreamer never knows the dream." When Aldrich reported to the bishop's chambers the next morning, he found the old man frantic. The bed curtains had been shredded as if by antlers. The embroidered stag was gone, and on the pillow lay a single blackened twig, the kind used for making charcoal. "Burn it," the bishop ordered, his hands shaking. Aldrich pocketed it instead. That evening he slipped it into the infirmary fire while murmuring Alison's name. The flames burned blue for a full minute, and for the first time in months he slept without dreams of libraries or ledgers or things that watched from between pages. Somewhere in the forest, a charcoal burner's daughter smiled in her sleep, and in the bishop's bedchamber, the curtains began stitching themselves back together, slowly, deliberately, with thread the color of dried blood. Chapter 19. The Dream Censorship of the Middle Ages. The first time Brother Aldrich saw the Inquisitor's ledger of forbidden dreams, he mistook it for a tax registry. The thick vellum pages listed names, dates, and offenses in neat clerical script, each entry marked with red ink where punishments had been meted out. Gahan le Tonnelier, 12 March 1383. Dreamt of a two-headed pope. Penance, 20 lashes. Marguerite de Provins, 29 April 1383. Vision of rats wearing priestly vestments. Penance, public recantation. Page after page documented the nocturnal crimes of ordinary peasants, artisans, and even minor nobles, all guilty of dreaming incorrectly. The system was elegant in its cruelty. Church authorities could not control what people dreamed, but they could control what they reported dreaming. Confessors were trained to ask leading questions, steering penitents toward acceptable vision. Did the Virgin appear to you clothed in blue? Were the angels properly winged? A dream that aligned with doctrine might earn a blessing. One that strayed too far into strange symbolism or worse, subversive allegory, could land the dreamer in a dungeon. Aldrich discovered the true extent of the censorship when he was assigned to assist Inquisitor Baudouin in compiling cases for the bishop's upcoming sermon on dream obedience. Hidden among the records was a second, smaller ledger, this one listing not the punishments but the dreams themselves in their uncensored form. Here, the two-headed pope became a grotesque parody of the Avignon schism, each face spewing different scripture. The priestly rats were seen feasting on communion wafers made of children's fingernails. These were not random nightmares. They were rebellions in symbolic form. The Inquisitor caught Aldrich studying the hidden ledger and merely smiled, tapping the page with a bone-white finger. The dream is the last place a man believes himself free. Our task is to remind him otherwise. The methods of enforcement varied. Simple cases received public penance, the dreamer forced to recite an approved version of their vision before the congregation. More stubborn offenders were subjected to dream correction, a process that involved sleep deprivation, forced recitation of orthodox imagery before bed, and in extreme cases, opiates to induce docile vision. The records spoke of one woman in Toulouse who, after dreaming 7 nights in a row of a church built from the bones of the poor, was dosed with laudanum until she produced acceptable dreams of docile lambs and harvest bounty. She was paraded through the streets as a repentant visionary. She hanged herself 3 weeks later. But the most insidious tactic was the rewriting of dreams after the fact. Aldrich witnessed a shoemaker being coached to remember his prophetic dream of a great fire as having included an angel with a warning from God, a detail conspicuously absent from his original account. By the time the man stood before the congregation, he spoke the corrected version with tearful conviction, as if the angel had always been there. The system worked flawlessly until the dreams began resisting. A wool merchant in Chartres, who had been punished for dreaming of a talking wolf, suddenly found the beast appearing in other villagers' sleep, whispering his name. A baker's wife, forced to recant her vision of the Virgin Mary wearing a beggar's rags, began waking with mysterious bruises in the shape of grasping hands, just as she described the false Mary in her original forbidden dream. Worst of all was the case of young Etienne, a scribe's apprentice who dreamed of a library where books screamed when opened. After months of correction, his dreams had ostensibly improved, now featuring kindly saints and divine light. But his waking hours grew increasingly bizarre. He would copy manuscripts perfectly, only for the words to rearrange themselves overnight into the same blasphemous phrases from his original visions. Inks he mixed turned to blood. Parchments he touched grew warm as living flesh. The final straw came when the bishop himself had a dream, one so unsettling he ordered it immediately recorded in the orthodox style, stripped of all disturbing elements. But the next morning, every copyist in the scriptorium found their work altered. The bishop's approved vision of a shining cathedral had transformed into a grotesque parody. The stonework made of compressed screams, the stained glass depicting tortured faces, the altar running with something dark and thick. That was when Aldrich understood the terrible truth. You could censor the dreamer. You could burn the records. But the dreams themselves? The dreams remembered. In the monastery crypt that night, Aldrich pried up the loose stone where had hidden the Yazomnikon and added a new entry to its margins. Gay tried to chain the river while the flood builds beneath their feet. The ink sank into the page as if the book had been thirsty. Somewhere in the dark, a ledger keeper's quill moved on its own, recording one final uncensored dream. The nightmare that would soon trouble every magistrate, bishop, and inquisitor from Paris to Rome. Unraveling. 1,000 voices speaking truths they had sworn to forget, and watching from the shadows, something that had been dreaming itself into existence for a very, very long time. Piety. Aldrich closed the book gently. Outside, the first screams of the night began, not from terror, but from the shock of remembering. Chapter 20. Modern Lessons from Medieval Dream Fears. Brother Aldrich was not present when they finally opened Brother Alcuin's tomb. He had been sent away by then, dispatched to a remote priory after one too many questions about the marks on his arms, the whispers in his sleep, the way birds fell silent when he walked beneath them. But he heard the stories. They said the tomb was empty, except for a single parchment resting where the skull should have been. They said the words upon it matched the ones Aldrich had carved into his cell wall the night before his exile. They said when the abbot reached to take it, the parchment crumbled to dust that spelled out a final phrase in the air before dissipating. I woke. In der Strizanten, Visitations to Punkapisisatsan. Jida. Nondes. Einsuhaya. Centuries later, in a university library in Paris, a graduate student named Claire Dubois, would uncover Aldrich's lost journals hidden inside a false binding. As she pored over the cramped Latin, she noticed something odd. The same symbols from his writings kept appearing in her own dream. A black stag with golden eyes. A library where the books bled. A door with 7 locks, each shaped like a sleeping face. Her advisor dismissed it as scholarly absorption, the natural consequence of immersing oneself in medieval text. But Claire knew better. Because sometimes, when she woke from these dreams, her hands would be stained with ink that wasn't hers. Sometimes her pillow smelled of mildew and crushed nettles. And once, only once, she woke certain someone had whispered insomnia vivant directly into her ear. The modern world has no room for such fantasies. We medicate disturbing dreams. We pathologize sleepwalking. We dismiss night terrors as misfiring synapses. But in our sanitized understanding of the unconscious, we've lost something the medieval world understood instinctively. That dreams are not just neural static, but a language. One that predates words. One that remembers even when we try to forget. Claire's dissertation committee rejected her proposed chapter on oniric contagion in monastic culture. The chair called it unsubstantiated speculation. But late at night, when the library stacks stood empty, she sometimes heard pages turning in locked special collections. Security cameras showed nothing. The sound always stopped when she approached. We like to believe we've outgrown medieval superstitions, that our sleep studies and brain scans have explained away the old fears. But every era gets the dreams it deserves. The 14th century dreamed of plague and religious terror. The 21st dreams of climate collapse and algorithmic dread. The symbols change, but the language remains the same. Claire eventually abandoned academia. She now runs a small bookstore in Lyon, where she keeps one volume permanently face out on the display shelf, a modern reprint of the Gizemninkon. Its cover bearing that peculiar indentation where brass letters once rested. Customers never notice how the book never quite gathers dust. They don't see how shadows pool around it differently than other volumes. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the light slants just so, the book appears to breathe. And if you were to open it, though Claire gently discourages this, you might find a new entry in the margins, written in ink that looks centuries old yet smells freshly spilled. Later dreamers change. The dream goes on. Outside, traffic passes. Phones ping. The modern world marches forward in its waking certainty. And deep beneath Lyon, in Roman catacombs not listed on any tourist map, something shifts in its sleep. The medieval world was right to fear dreams, but they feared the wrong thing. It was never the nightmares that were dangerous. It was the waking up.